Mr Speaker, and can I thank you for your remarks of welcome to Sammy Woodhouse, a very brave woman who has done the right thing in waiving her anonymity. We must all call out crimes of sexual violence. Those responsible must be held to account. Mr Speaker, we were promised strong and stable. What we have is a government in crisis. A government that has lost 2 Brexit secretaries, a Home Secretary, a Foreign Secretary, a Work and Pension Secretary. A government that has suffered from 3 consecutive defeats in just 2 hours. The first government to do so, Mr Speaker, in 40 years. And now a government found to be in contempt of Parliament. Is it time that the Prime Minister took responsibility? A responsibility for concealing the facts on her Brexit deal from members in this House and the public. Will she take responsibility? Blackford. Mr Speaker, that is an incredibly disappointing response from the Prime Minister. The facts have had to be dragged out of this government by Parliament. Mr Speaker, this morning we have seen the detail of the legal advice. We have seen the facts that the government tried to hide. Mr Speaker, this government is giving Northern Ireland permanent membership of the single market and the customs union. The legal advice is clear. It states, despite statements in the protocol that is not intended to be permanent, in international law, the protocol would endure indefinitely. Since the Prime Minister returned from Brussels with her deal, the Prime Minister has been misleading the House, inadvertently or otherwise. The Prime Minister must explain...
Order. There can be no suggestion of otherwise. The right honourable gentleman must make it clear that there is no suggestion that the government is misleading the House deliberately. There can be no question of that. If the right honourable gentleman wants to use the word inadvertently, which people do now and again, he can, but there must be no ambiguity on the point. And I ask the right honourable gentleman to clarify that matter and to order. No, I don't need any advice from anyone. I know exactly what I'm doing, and the right honourable gentleman must comply. Mr Ian Blackford.
Mr Speaker, I did use the word inadvertently, and I repeat it. That since the Prime Minister has returned from Brussels with her deal, the Prime Minister has been misleading the House, perhaps inadvertently. The Prime Minister...
Order. I always want the right honourable gentleman to be heard fully, and he will be. But there can be no imputation of dishonour, and the insertion of the word perhaps suggests the right honourable gentleman wants to keep his options open. The option of imputing dishonour does not exist. That word must now be removed. Please rephrase, continue and complete briefly. Mr Ian Blackford.
Mr Speaker, I say again inadvertently. Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister must explain. The Prime Minister must explain why she continues to deny Scotland the rights and opportunities that her deal offers to other parts of the United Kingdom.
Mr Speaker, every single Brexit scenario this government have modelled shows GDP growth to fall, and to fall further when the impact of ending freedom of movement is factored in. This Prime Minister continues to pretend ending free movement is a good thing. It is a bad thing. So let me ask her, why is she prepared to take from our children and grandchildren the ability to travel freely throughout Europe? And why is she doing it in a way which is economically illiterate?
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In the Scottish case, which has established that Article 50, or the Prime Minister's Article 50 notice, can indeed be revoked, the UK Government has lost 3 times, in the Supreme Court of Scotland, in the UK Supreme Court, and yesterday in the Advocate General's opinion in the Court of Justice of the European Union. Can the Prime Minister tell us why she has put so much public money and so much energy into depriving this Parliament of legal certainty about the options which will be open to it when her deal is voted down next week?
Mr Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The European Structural Fund is worth billions to Scotland and funds initiatives in my constituency of North Ayrshire and Arran, such as tackling poverty and promoting social inclusion. This is to be replaced by the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. However, we have no real detail or clarity as to how this fund will be designed or when it will begin. Why not?
So, the honourable gentleman.
Very grateful to him for giving way. Can I just impress upon him again the acute problems that there have been in fishing on the west coast of Scotland and indeed in Northern Ireland? And I don't know how many numerous meetings I've had with various government ministers. They come and they go over the time. But would he look next year to make sure that this doesn't happen again? That we're making sure we're getting crews on boats and we make sure that non-EE labour are coming in. The problem is going to get worse with the situation we have at the moment. The Home Secretary has it in his gift. It's not Europe that's stopping him, it's in his gift. He can lift the pen. This will happen. He will be thanked and appreciated across the west coast of Scotland if he does that.
To the honourable lady who's been very patient. Thank you.
Grateful to the Home Secretary for giving way. I just want to disturb the slightly cosy consensus that was arising there between the Labour front bench and some between the government front bench and some on the Labour backbenches, because of course the view on immigration in Scotland is different. Voters in Scotland don't want to reduce immigration. Business, the universities, the financial sector, the fintech sector, the cyber security sector in my constituency are very keen not to reduce migration into Scotland. Is he aware of that, and will he take that on board in his white paper? For giving way. She mentioned a moment ago that one of the main reasons people voted to leave was a concern about sovereignty, and she referred to the views of the late and very well respected member for Chesterfield. But can I just ask her to speculate on this? Why is it that the Irish, the French, the Germans, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Swedish, the Danes, I could go on, do not share the same concerns that the English, not the Scots, that the English do about sovereignty in the European Union? Would you care to answer that question? Because it's a question that genuinely puzzles me.
I think the French do.
I don't think it's...
Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for East Surrey, and I applaud his courage in resigning as a result of his concerns about the deal. Mr Speaker, there's much I could say about the detail of this agreement. Red lines breached, for example, in the Court of Justice of the European Union, Articles 87, 89, 158 and 174 and Article 14 of the Protocol in relation to Northern Ireland to make it very clear that the Prime Minister has had to make some pretty major concessions on her red line on the Court of Justice. We heard in the Chamber, and we've now seen it in writing clearly in the legal advice, that on the Northern Ireland backstop, as a matter of law, we could be trapped in the backstop permanently and unable to get out of it, as I sought to clarify with the Attorney General earlier this week. And we've also seen that in relation to the Northern Ireland backstop, the catch of fishing vessels registered in Northern Ireland will have preferential treatment in having tariff-free access to the market in a way that fishing vessels registered elsewhere in the United Kingdom, including Scotland, will not have. And I very much look forward, but not hold my breath, to hear the Scottish Conservatives making a fuss about that. I think today, Mr Speaker, is really, and the next few days should really be about the bigger picture. I'm really looking forward to having an in-depth debate about immigration in due course, if we ever do see that much promised white paper. But I do want to just say a few remarks about it just now, before I move on to the bigger picture. As I said earlier, it is a matter of record, because Scotland voted to remain, that the Scots did not hold the same concerns about sovereignty or immigration as have been held elsewhere in these islands. Yet the political declaration confirms the UK Government's intention to end freedom of movement. And that will see people across these islands, but in particular the Scots who didn't vote for it, lose the rights they have as EU citizens. It's a deal which will see us made poorer, not just economically, but also equally importantly, socially. Hear, hear. Even the MAC have acknowledged that inward migration has made an overwhelmingly positive contribution to the economy of these islands, and particularly Scotland. In fact, the MAC, whilst failing to acknowledge the need for regional and national variations in immigration policy across the UK, it did knock on the head many of the myths about immigration which drove the sort of xenophobia which led to the poster that the Right Honourable member, the Labour Party spokesperson, described earlier. So, Scotland in particular, Mr Speaker, has benefited from inward migration because at the start of this century we had a dwindling population, and that EU migration has built our population and has brought many young and economically active people into Scotland. And it is a fact, and any Scottish MP who holds surgeries regularly will tell you it is a fact, and I have 2 major universities in my constituency and all the academics tell me it is a fact that the process of Brexit and the rhetoric around immigration in this country is discouraging people from coming to live and work and study in Scotland. The Scots didn't vote for that. And that's one of the many reasons why we won't be supporting this deal. Freedom of movement has been something that has been vital to fill gaps in the employment market in Scotland and indeed across the United Kingdom. We've got a big crisis across the UK in how we look after our ageing population. A lot of the people who look after our ageing population at present come from elsewhere in the European Union, and it will be a real shame if we discourage them from coming here in the future. But let's look... Yes, I'll give way.
I'm interested by what she's saying, and I'm somebody who agrees with her, really, on students coming to the United Kingdom and should be able to work for a period as part of the payback. I think that is important. But doesn't she accept the fact that there are many people who voted Brexit who are not saying no to immigration, it's just controlling immigration, and it's that this Parliament or the government of this country should be the one that decides immigration levels?
Well, nobody's saying that we shouldn't have an immigration policy. Of course we have to have an immigration policy. The point I'm making is that the immigration policy should be evidence-based and should take account of the needs of the economy and the different regions and nations of these islands, and this government's policy does not. If this government has such a great idea about the future policy on immigration across the UK, why is it taking them so long to bring forward the white paper? And if they're so keen to throw their arms open to people from all across the world and have everyone come here on an equal basis, why does the Prime Minister, your Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of these benches opposite, persist in her ridiculous net migration target? It's just nonsense that the benches opposite want to throw the doors open. For so long as the Prime Minister is in place and that ridiculous migration target's in place, that simply won't be happening. I'll give way to...
Very grateful to my honourable learned friend for giving way. Isn't the reality, though, that the government will try as much to ramp up the rhetoric around about EU migrants, but the reality is to try and get some of their trade deals through, they're going to have to bend the rules when it comes to visas for India and the likes anyway. So what they're taking with one hand, they're giving with the other anyway.
I entirely agree with my honourable friend. It is crystal clear that countries outside the European Union, if we ever get to the stage of being able to enter into third-party trade deals, and that looks pretty unlikely at the moment, but if we ever get to that stage, in return for access to their markets, they're going to want access to the UK for people who want to migrate from their country here. And I want to just touch briefly on the position of EU citizens. Yes, I will, of course.
I'm thankful for her for giving way. Will she agree with me that it is the language around immigration that has been so incredibly toxic? And that, like people like me, I'm a European migrant, and I look around and think, do they mean me? And that is exactly what other Europeans feel as well.
Yes,
I do agree with the Honourable Lady, and I think part of the reason the language has been so toxic is we haven't been talking about the reality of the situation, we've been talking about a perceived reality. And something that a Labour member, an honourable member, I think he's not in his place any longer, a point he made earlier, I think, which I entirely agree with, is that the benches opposite, the government benches, by their policies, have created a great deal of poverty across the United Kingdom. Wales and Scotland have, to an extent, been protected from that because we have had different devolved governments. I notice as I travel around provincial England that the infrastructure is not in such a good condition as it is in Scotland. No social housing has been built here for years. In contrast, we're building a lot of social housing in Scotland. I think many working-class people in England have been led to believe that the cause of their woes, the fact they can't get a house, the fact they can't get a well-paid job, OK, they can get a job but not a properly paid job, they've been led to believe that that's the fault of the immigrants when it's the fault of this toxic Conservative government. Now, under the withdrawal agreement, EU citizens who are already here will not continue to enjoy the same rights that they do at present. I know they'll continue to enjoy some rights, but it won't be the same rights. They'll lose their lifelong right of return. They won't have the same family reunification rights. And they'll get no protection from inadvertently becoming undocumented illegal citizens. And my goodness, Mr. Speaker, the Windrush scandal has taught us what happens to undocumented citizens, lawful citizens in this country. God help EU citizens who find themselves undocumented. Illegal citizens. Don't take my word for it, take the word of the National Audit Office and reports of various committees in this House. And in order to hang on to the rights they already have, not to get a passport, but to get the digital identity that means they can hang on to the rights they already have, EU citizens are going to have fees imposed upon them. Now, in Scotland, the Scottish Government has said that they will pay those fees for those working in the public sector. And now it looks like there might be a bit of a tax catch in relation to that, and I'm looking forward to the Conservative Government addressing that properly and perhaps extending the same largesse as the Scottish Government has to people working in the public sector at the south of the border. I'm going to touch briefly on the security, justice and law enforcement issues, because I think it's been said very clearly by others. It is simply impossible for us as a third country to have the same degree of security, justice and law cooperation as we previously had. And I think, in fairness, the Home Secretary recognised that. But one of the things that's concerned those of us who represent Scottish constituencies, some of us at least, and the Scottish Government and commentators in Scotland most about this process has been the abject failure of the British Government to recognise that Scotland has a separate civil and criminal justice system. Now, this isn't about devolution. This is about the Act of Union. Scotland has had a separate legal system forever and it's protected by the Act of Union. Yet our separate criminal justice system, our separate civil law system, our separate law officers have not been consulted properly in relation to the impact of these matters on the Scottish legal system. And of course, as we know, there's no mention whatsoever of Scotland in the withdrawal agreement or the political declaration. A lot of other much smaller regions get a mention, but not Scotland. And this isn't just fanciful, Mr. Speaker. I know, because I used to work in the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service, that cooperation across Europe has made a huge difference to law enforcement in Scotland, and that if we lose that, we will be the worse as a result of it. But as I said, Mr. Speaker, earlier, I think today is really a day for the bigger picture. And I see the bigger picture as somebody who represents a Scottish constituency and somebody of Irish parentage. I see the bigger picture of the whole Brexit process really as a tale of two unions. The union that is the United Kingdom and the union that is the European Union, and the extremely stark differences as to how the members of those unions treat each other. So far as Ireland is concerned, both North and South, British politicians largely overlooked the threat that Brexit posed to the Good Friday Agreement until after the referendum. And even then, many, particularly on the benches opposite, were unable to accept, and still are unable to accept, the reality of the legal obligations which the United Kingdom undertook in the Good Friday Agreement. And that old anti-Irish xenophobia, which people like my mother remember so well, has raised its head again, even to the extent of some on the benches opposite talking about the Irish tail wagging the British dog and other such insulting metaphors. But because the EU 27 got behind the Irish government's legitimate concerns, they became central to the Brexit process. Politicians on the benches opposite, not all of them, but some of them, and indeed a few behind me, waited in vain for the EU 27 to crack and throw Ireland under the bus. It didn't happen, and it's not going to happen. I was at an event recently where the very distinguished Professor of Modern History at UCD, Mary Daly, remarked that the current situation in this House has very uncanny echoes of what happened here 100 years ago, when the electric politics of Ulster determined what happened at Westminster. And it's really quite ironic that that should be so, Mr Speaker, as we're shortly to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the election of the first female MP to this Parliament, who was, of course, a distinguished Irish nationalist, the Countess Markievicz, who went on to be the first woman Cabinet Minister in Western Europe. But the truth is, the problems that arose as a result of partition have come back to haunt this House as a result of the Brexit process. I think something that unites us all is we want to see peace kept in Northern Ireland. And yes, I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
Would she accept that the Republic of Ireland actually has been thrown under the bus and don't even realise that the wheels are running over them at present? Because if this agreement goes through, a border down the Irish Sea will not only affect Northern Ireland, but the Republic of Ireland, whose main market is GB, who takes its goods across the GB as a land bridge and will find checks not just at Holyhead but at Dover.
Well, no, I don't accept that, and I speak regularly with politicians from all parties in the Republic of Ireland, and certainly that's not how they see matters. And in fact, politicians and indeed business and the wider community in the Republic of Ireland are broadly very, very happy with the way that the European Union has dealt with this. And of course, Mr Speaker, it's sometimes conveniently forgot in this House that Northern Ireland voted to remain in the European Union. And that's partly because during this time, Northern Ireland hasn't had the democratic voice of its assembly. So it's only the voices of the honourable gentleman that has been heard in relation to Northern Ireland. And of course, the honourable gentleman's party, the DUP, do not represent the majority of people in Northern Ireland who voted to remain. And the Prime Minister has refused to meet with the Greens, the SDLP, Sinn Féin or the Alliance, which I think is really quite disgraceful. Anyway, Mr Speaker, meanwhile in Scotland voted to remain in the EU by an even more substantial margin than Northern Ireland, 62%. And polls show if a vote was held tomorrow, it would be nearer 70%. Despite that, the Scottish Government's concerns, and it's a democratically elected government, I know benches opposite like to call it the SNP government and pretend it doesn't have any legitimacy, but it was elected democratically. Its concerns, often supported by other parties in the Scottish Parliament, as it will be today, when Liberal Democrats, Greens and Labour will vote with the SNP in trying to protect Scotland from the consequences of Brexit, the legitimate concerns of the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament have been wholly ignored, and we can really only look with envy whilst the concerns of the Irish Government have been centre stage in Brussels. And unlike Northern Ireland, Mr Speaker, Scotland has actually had a strong and functioning government and parliament during this process, well able to express its views, but that hasn't protected us. And so this Brexit process has highlighted the limits of devolved as opposed to independent government. Yes, I will give way on that point.
I thank honourable friends for giving way, and she's absolutely right. We fully expect the Scottish Parliament this evening to endorse a cross-party motion rejecting the withdrawal agreement, just as the Welsh Assembly did last night. The Scottish Conservatives are describing that debate as needless. Scotland doesn't need to talk about Brexit. Westminster, the big Parliament, will make that decision for you. Know your place. That exemplifies how they want to undermine devolution and use Brexit to do so.
Of course, the Scottish Conservatives don't represent the majority of Scottish opinion in relation to anything, let alone Brexit. It's often forgotten, after all the hullabaloo about the seats they won last year, that they are still very much in the minority in Scottish politics and very much in the minority in the Scottish Parliament. But let's just look at what has happened in relation to Scotland over the last 2 years. The UK Government cut the Scottish Government out of the Brexit negotiations completely. The Scottish Government put forward a differentiated deal, the idea of a differentiated deal or the idea of a compromise for the whole of the United Kingdom at an early stage. That was completely ignored. The Scottish Parliament voted, again with cross-party support, everyone apart from the Tories and one Lib Dem, voted to withhold consent to the EU withdrawal bill. That was ignored. When the Scottish Parliament tried to pass its own legal continuity bill, it was challenged in the UK Supreme Court, and we're still waiting for that decision, challenged by the British Government. And when amendments came back from the House of Lords to the floor of this House in relation to the withdrawal bill, Scottish MPs got 19 minutes to debate the implications of those amendments, and the full time was taken up by the Government Minister. Scotland isn't mentioned in the withdrawal agreement or the political declaration, and whilst little Gibraltar, important as it is, was afforded advance sight of the agreement, the Scottish Government only saw it when the rest of us did. So what the point I'm making, Mr Speaker, is Scotland's marginalisation and its very weak bargaining position within the union that is the United Kingdom has been very exposed by Brexit. After our failure in the independence referendum of 2014, 56 Scottish National Party MPs were elected to this House, yet not one of our amendments to the Scotland Bill at that time got passed, despite the fact we had 56 out of the 59 seats in Scotland and 50% of the vote at that time. Not one. But yet we were told this wonderful Scotland Act was going to give us huge amounts of powers, and we had the most powerful devolved parliament in the world. Well, I ask any fair-minded person in this chamber or anyone watching, does the sequence of events that I've just described really sound like the most powerful devolved parliament in the world to you? Of course it doesn't, because devolution's constitutional fragility has been revealed in Westminster's assertion of control and the attempt to repatriate powers here from Brussels, and also the disregard shown for Scotland's preferences in the negotiations with Brussels. So, Mr Speaker, the Brexit process has told Scottish voters a lot about the reality of devolution, and that power devolved is indeed power retained, and that the United Kingdom is not the union of equals we were told it was before 2014, but a unitary state where devolved power is retrieved to the centre when convenient, and no one but the Conservative Party, who only represent a minority of voters in Scotland, get a say on major decisions over trade and foreign policy. So, Mr Speaker, the experience of Ireland and Scotland during the Brexit process show us there's a very significant contrast between the way that the nations who are member states of the European Union are treated and the nations who are members of this union are treated. And I heard the very distinguished former Taoiseach of the Republic of Ireland, John Bruton, speak recently, and he was asked about this, not by me, but by somebody else in the audience. And he said Scotland's marginalisation within the United Kingdom wouldn't happen in the European Union. If the European Union was taking a decision as drastic as Brexit, and it only had 4 nations in it, then all 4 nations would have needed to have agreed. But in the UK, it doesn't matter what Scotland and Northern Ireland say. They can always be overridden by the English vote. And that is not an anti-English comment, it is a comment on the constitution of the United Kingdom. If Scotland was a member state in the EU, albeit a country of only 5.5 million, we would have, just like Ireland, the same veto over such a major decision, in the same way that the big countries have. Now, Mr Speaker, there is still a little bit of hope for Scotland, and it comes from the cross-party working that we've seen in Scotland, both in the Scottish Parliament today and in the group of politicians of which I'm proud to have been a member, who took the case to the Court of Justice of the European Union, where we found out yesterday the Advocate General says Article 50 can be unilaterally revoked. And I was interested to hear the Prime Minister, in response to my question earlier today, acknowledge that it's highly likely that the Grand Chamber of the Court will follow the Advocate General's opinion. So it seems that Scotland and Scottish politicians and the Scottish courts are throwing this Parliament a lifeline to get out of the madness of Brexit. But even if we do throw that lifeline, and even if the United Kingdom Parliament takes it, and even if there is a second referendum, and even if the whole of the UK is smart enough in possession of the full facts to vote to remain part of the European Union, don't think that will be the Scottish question closed, because the Brexit process has wholly revealed our inferior status within this union, and people will not forget that. Now, Mr Speaker, I'm just coming to a conclusion. The last 2 years have shown us that the Leave vote was won across the United Kingdom on the back of promises that have proved undeliverable. Now, many people say that those promises were lies, but whether they were lies or not, what we do know is that they've proved undeliverable. Now, it's hard for me to be fair to the Prime Minister because of the scorn she has shown for Scottish democracy, but I'm going to try to be fair to her, and I'm going to say this. I don't think this is a bad deal because the Prime Minister is a bad negotiator. The truth is, there is no better deal than the one the United Kingdom currently enjoys within the European Union. The Prime Minister at least tried to negotiate a deal. Others who led the Leave movement have totally and utterly abdicated their responsibility. And I watched with interest yesterday while the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip attempted or struggled to explain what it is that he wants. I was none the wiser by the end of his speech. And let's not forget his partner in crime in the Leave movement, who was left his place on the Treasury bench now. But the member for Surrey Heath, yes. Why didn't he take the job of Brexit Secretary when it was offered to him a couple of weeks ago? Why, if you desire something so much, why not take the responsibility of delivering it? I think we all know the answer to that question. And then, of course, there's the Right Honourable Member for Halton Price and Howden. His insouciant appearances at the Brexit Select Committee were really highly entertaining, but also deeply shocking. And now, where is he? I don't see him much in the chamber in the last few days, but he's certainly not proposing any firm alternative to this deal. So, Mr Speaker, the Court of Justice of the European Union, the much maligned Court of Justice of the European Union, with the assistance of Scottish parliamentarians and the Scottish courts, has opened up new vistas of possibility for this chamber. There is a chance of reversing the madness, but I accept that there will need to be a second vote. In order to do that, we'll have to work cross-party in this chamber. There's a lot of that going on already, but may I respectfully suggest that parliamentarians in this chamber look north to what's happening in Edinburgh this afternoon and see that it's possible. It's possible at least for the SNP, the Labour Party, the Lib Dems and the Greens to work together. And we know from this House that it's also possible for the parties I've just mentioned to work together with some members on the benches opposite. But I want to make something crystal clear, Mr Speaker. Make no mistake, if there is a second vote across the UK, and if England, in possession of the full facts and the reality of Brexit, votes again to leave, and I'm quite sure Scotland will vote to remain, then Scotland won't stand for that, and there will have to be a second independence referendum. And this time we know that we will have a far more sympathetic ear in Europe than we had before. Why, even the Spanish, supposedly Scotland's great enemies, their foreign minister said recently that if Scotland secedes from the UK constitutionally, he will not veto Scotland's membership of the European Union. And as I said yesterday, I very much hope that when an independent Scotland comes to try and seek membership of the European Union, it will be remembered that it was Scottish parliamentarians and the Scottish courts who attempted to give the UK Parliament an escape route from Brexit. But even if the United Kingdom does take that lifeline and that escape route, I think it's quite clear that this Brexit process has shown that the United Kingdom in its present form is not a union in which Scotland can continue to function properly. We have seen, now I'm coming to my end, we've seen written large during this process the difference between what it means to be a member of the United Kingdom and a member of the European Union. In the European Union, even small countries like Ireland are equal partners with big countries like Germany and France. In the United Kingdom, a small country like Scotland is not an equal partner with England. The power devolved is the power retained, and Scottish democracy is always at the whim of the majority in this House. It's not tolerable, Mr Speaker, and despite what happens with Brexit, which I very much hope is reversed for the whole of the United Kingdom, I hope that the Scots will soon take the opportunity to say that Scotland's position in the UK Union is not tolerable, and we want to take our seat at the top table in Europe, in the European Union, where I very much hope we will eventually be an equal partner with England, because I hope England stays too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr Speaker, thank you for calling me in this debate, and I appreciate your forbearance and patience because it's been a long afternoon. But I just wanted to say, first of all, my constituency of Lanark and Hamilton East voted, along with every other area in Scotland, to remain, and yet time and time again Scotland has been repeatedly ignored. Now, because I have such limited time, I'm going to focus what I wish to say on three main points, and that is that this deal, I believe, is bad for young people, it's bad for women, and it's bad for the economy.
Hear, hear.
Now, the SNP have repeatedly argued it was best for jobs, economy and living standards to remain in the single market, and we refused to be dragged by those on the right into a self-defeating argument about immigration. Instead, at every opportunity, we focused on the positives of the freedom of movement and the ability to live, work and travel across 27 countries. And yet, as well as the rich economic, cultural and societal benefits that migrants have brought to our country. Since 2016, many of the EU citizens and their families that I've met with, French-born, German-born, teachers, nurses, people who have raised their families and for the vast majority of their life have spent their time in Scotland, are concerned about their ability to continue to live in the home that they call Scotland. Now, that's just one instance of where there is still a lack of certainty. But for young people, it was my predecessor, Winnie Ewan, Madame Ecosse, who championed the Erasmus programme. And we should not deny future generations of young people the opportunity to learn, to travel and to broaden their horizons. And sadly, that's exactly what Brexit will only serve to do. In fact, if anything, the opposite. It is for all of these reasons and more that the SNP have repeatedly argued to remain in the EU and, short of that, remain in the single market and the customs union, without which free trade arrangements, which will introduce barriers to trade, will damage jobs, investments, productivity and earnings. And on that point, I wanted to come to the point of women, because in fact this will only serve to hit the most disadvantaged and the most vulnerable the hardest. The Women's Budget Group and the Fawcett Society examined the economic impact on Brexit and found serious implications for women, predominantly those who are workers, consumers and the vast majority who are users of public services. The cuts that this government have placed on them already have a disproportionate impact on women, and yet a failure to prioritise gender equality has led to an increased economic insecurity and inequality for these women. Now, there is nothing that this debate has served to do except to highlight how much of Brexit has taken over the agenda, when I should have been in Westminster Hall this afternoon condemning the government on its record on gender inequality, but instead I'm here debating this. But that's, of course, where we're at, and I wouldn't choose to be anywhere else on this day than debate this important subject. But there are so many other important subjects that are being completely neglected. Now, in most scenarios, real wages for low-paid workers have been reduced and prices will increase and inevitably increase further, as well as the reduced levels of productivity. Now, the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty outlined that it was clear that the impact of Brexit was an afterthought, and that's the point here. So I wish to focus on those who have already been forgotten in this debate. Now, the vulnerable in my constituency, the 1 in 4 children who grow up in poverty, are only and that's only expected to increase. And people will ultimately be worse off, and we know this for a fact. Is that not a sufficient reason in itself for the government to reconsider its actions, to prioritise protecting the interests of those who need it most and who are most at risk of the harsh impact of Brexit? Instead, what are we doing? We're freezing the benefits, we're hitting them with 5-week delays in universal credit, and we're fully acknowledging by visiting food banks that there's an issue here and that we need to do more to support food banks. It's a scandal, frankly, that these people are an afterthought, and that's frankly how this comes across. While we stand here and discuss Brexit, people won't go hungry at Christmas, people will go without food, children will go without gifts, and that's the least of many families' problems. Now, my constituency is home to many multinational companies that rely on trade with Europe. In fact, Europe is the 8th largest, or 8 times the size of the UK market. So our relationship with Europe couldn't be more important. So whether it's DFDS, the largest employer in Larkhall that duly delivers to all major fish markets and distribution centres, whether it's Tunnocks in Uddingston, who sell their famous tea cakes and caramel wafers across Europe and beyond, whether it's Borders Biscuits based in Lanark with customers across the EU, all of these businesses are not only businesses who trade across Europe, but they're employers in my constituency. Now, their trade and the trade of many others rely on a good deal for Europe, and it is in my opinion that this withdrawal deal fails to deliver. It offers no guarantees of frictionless access to the single market. It places Scotland at a serious competitive disadvantage to Northern Ireland and, frankly, to the Union that you're so keen to keep. It's no certainty for stability for the UK's economy and relationship with the EU in the long term. And thank you for chuntering from a sedentary position. Let's remember that in 2014, the people were told to remain in the EU, that the only way to remain in the UK was to remain in the EU was to remain as part of the UK. Now, please tell me how that's working out for us. Good job, guys. So frankly, tonight, as cross-party support across the Scottish Parliament from 4 of the 5 main parties reject this deal, it is now time for all of these reasons and more that I will be voting against this withdrawal arrangement and agreement and supporting the amendments to protect businesses, to protect jobs and, most importantly, to protect the most vulnerable in my constituency. I cannot honestly in good conscience vote for a bad deal. And the bottom line is this. See when the Tories and everyone else across here protected the Union by telling people they could stay in the EU and then pulling the rug out from under them the minute people voted to remain part of the UK, what kind of deal is that for Scotland? So of course Scotland's going to vote for independence.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it is an honour, if not a challenge, to follow the excellent contribution from the Right Honourable Member from Gedling.
Well said.
Mr. Speaker, it will surprise no one when I say that I, along with every one of my SNP colleagues, will be voting against the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement when the House divides on Tuesday. And I will vote against it because it's a very bad deal for Scotland, but also because it's a potentially catastrophic deal for the people of my Argyll and Bute constituency. What we in Argyll and Bute have been asked to do by the Prime Minister is to support a deal, one that by every analysis will make us poorer, and one which will put us at a competitive disadvantage when compared to our near neighbours in Northern Ireland, just a few miles across the water from the Mull of Kintyre. Mr. Speaker, I believe it would be a dereliction of duty on my part if I was to back this deal, because I would not be acting in the best interests of my constituents, or my country, or indeed the rest of the United Kingdom, if I was to support a deal which I believe would be harmful to the social, economic and cultural well-being of the people of Argyll and Bute. For the past 2 years, the Prime Minister has told us repeatedly that no deal is better than a bad deal. We were assured that there were no circumstances in which the Prime Minister would sign up to a bad deal, and yet what we're being asked to vote on next week is exactly that, a bad deal, a very bad deal, because any deal that puts Scotland at a competitive disadvantage can only be a bad deal. And any deal which prevents us from attracting people to Argyll and Bute from right across Europe to live, to work, invest, to raise a family, in order to reverse decades-long stream of depopulation is a very bad deal. And I commend 100% and endorse the remarks made last night by my right honourable friend, the member for Ross Skye and Lochaber, when he said to those EU nationals who have chosen to make Scotland their home that you are welcome. We thank you for choosing to live in Scotland. We welcome the contribution you make to our lives and our economy, and your presence enriches our culture. And that point was made forcibly to me last night by a constituent who contacted me, Mr Graham Lyon, and he wants to know how the Prime Minister can justify causing such economic and social harm by the ending of freedom of movement which I say has enriched every one of us in this country. So how can I possibly support such an agreement? One that will have such disastrous consequences for our inshore fisheries fleet, our world-famous shellfish and finfish industries, one that fails to protect our fragile West Coast hill farming community, and one that denies our vital tourism industry the access to that continent-wide pool of labour they so desperately need. I will not and I cannot support this deal. Of course, Mr Speaker, none of this should come as a surprise to the Prime Minister, because she came to Scotland personally last week to meet the people of the country and to listen to their concerns. Yes, aye, right, so she did. Because meeting and listening to the people of Scotland does not mean arriving at Glasgow Airport at 3 o'clock, driving 12 minutes to a factory at Bridge of Weir, where a hand-picked group of journalists were waiting while the rest stood outside in the rain. It's not about firing out that old cliché about our precious union before jumping back in the car for the 12-minute drive back to Glasgow Airport to be back in the air and out the country by 6 o'clock that evening. Mr Speaker, that is nobody's definition of meeting or listening to the people of Scotland. In fact, it's an insult to the people of Scotland. If the Prime Minister really wanted to hear the voice of Scotland, then perhaps she should have listened to the CNN report by Erin McLaughlin that was done from Glasgow on that same day as she flew into Bridge of Weir. because what that report showed was that the people of Scotland were insulted by the contempt shown by the Prime Minister, by the sham of a PR stunt. It showed also that the people of Scotland don't want to be dragged out of the European Union against their will. Indeed, one young Glaswegian gentleman was so incensed that he inadvertently perhaps used a form of industrial language rarely heard on the streets of the dear green place. And what the CNN report also showed was that the people of Glasgow and the people of Scotland are moving from no to yes on the question of Scottish independence. Because this was not the future that Scotland was promised in 2014, when we were told that only by voting no in the independence referendum would we be able to retain our European Union citizenship. No one was told when they voted no back in 2014 that not only would they be giving the green light to Scotland being dragged out of the European Union, but that Scotland would become poorer and we would be put quite deliberately at a competitive disadvantage compared to other parts of the UK. The hollow promises made by those advocating a no vote in 2014 was that the Scottish Parliament would be the world's most powerfully devolved Parliament. And yet from that day to this, that Parliament has been ignored, sidelined and disregarded. And tonight, that Parliament rejected the Prime Minister's withdrawal deal by 92 to 29 votes. I wonder what cognizance this government will take of that world's most powerfully devolved Parliament. I suspect we already know the answer to that one, Mr Speaker. But I sincerely ask them to take on board what the Scottish Parliament has said, because they are absolutely right. There is an escape route being offered, and I urge the government to take it, because despite the Prime Minister's bluster, I do not believe that this is a take-it-or-leave-it situation. Mr Speaker, this whole Brexit process has been an embarrassing fiasco. Over the past 2 years, we've heard about a hard Brexit, a soft Brexit and a blind Brexit. Well, Mr Speaker, I think after yesterday we are now in the realms of a bust-ball Brexit. And regardless of how this fiasco is resolved, this is exactly why Scotland needs the full powers of an independent Parliament, not just so we can stop and reverse this Brexit chaos, but to ensure that never again will Scotland be reduced to being a passive bystander while things are done to it and for it by a government and a Prime Minister that the people of Scotland have overwhelmingly and consistently rejected.
Thank you. Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I like to think that you've been employing the Emery effect tonight by keeping me on the bench so I can come on and make a late impact. So thank you for that. It's not often I see one of the Scots Tories speaking and I think of our president. But I've got to say I thought of it tonight, and I was reminded during the rather tortured contribution of the honourable member from Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk, who's no longer in his place, by the quote from George Bush, who said, "I have my own opinions, strong ones. I just don't always agree with them." Mr Speaker, I would be right to be greatly concerned by this deal that's on offer. I think justifiably. It is a democratic outrage that Scotland has been dragged out of the EU, or is being dragged out of the EU against the people's vote in Scotland. 62% voted to remain. All 32 local authorities voted to remain. And tonight, as we've heard in the Scottish Parliament, all of the opposition, all of the parties in the Parliament, with the exception of the Tories, have voted 92 to 29 to reject the deal on offer. I would also be greatly concerned, rightly greatly concerned, Mr Speaker, by as what was described as the economic illiteracy from my colleague, the honourable member for Dundee East earlier, when he pointed out that this is already costing £600 per person per year. And Scottish Government analysis says that in Scotland this deal will make Scotland £9 billion worse off by 2030. That's £1,600 per person per year. Even the Chancellor himself admitted that this is going to make our economy smaller. Mr Speaker, I would be right to be concerned by those things, but the thing that worries me most is what we are becoming in this place, and the message that we've heard from many honourable members and right honourable members in this chamber tonight about the message that's sent out about what we feel about other people in other countries. I've had the great honour of performing a function, it's an unpaid role, as an honorary consul for Romania since 2011. That's the time I've been doing it both unofficially and officially. And I can tell you that the European citizens, those European nationals, those Romanians who come to work in the Highlands and Islands are fantastic people. They have all made a genuine contribution to our communities. They've slotted in as friends, as neighbours and as contributors to our communities. They've been part of the fabric of our communities. And I can say the same for the Poles, for the French, for the Germans, for all of the citizens that are EU nationals that have contributed to the Highland economy. Because Brexit doesn't only have consequences for business, the economies and communities. It affects each of us as individuals, our very identities. There is a quote from the Scottish Government's national outcomes that I'd like to read to you. It says, Scotland's national and cultural identity is defined by our sense of place, sense of history and sense of self. It is defined by what it means to be Scottish, to live in a modern Scotland and to have an affinity with Scotland and to be able to participate in Scottish society. A flourishing economy and society depend on ambition and self-confidence in Scotland and on Scotland's effective integration into the European and global economy. Our international reputation will influence the extent to which people see Scotland as a great place in which to live, learn, visit, work, do business and invest. A good quality of life and a strong, fair and inclusive national identity are important if Scotland is to prosper and if we are to achieve sustainable economic growth. That's the kind of Scotland that I want to live in. And our European identity and our shared EU values are very much at the heart of this. I've spoken earlier about the vote in Scotland, the overwhelming vote. Yet European Scots face not only the economic and social impacts of Brexit, they face losing their European identity. And there was a nice piece in the Sunday Herald a while back in 2016 that said Scotland has been an outward-looking European nation since the late Middle Ages. From the 16th century, Scots merchants, academics and soldiers spread far and wide in the continent, establishing communities in countries like Poland, Sweden and the Low Countries. Our bond, our connection with European nations is deep and strong and long-lasting. In the Highlands, we've long had a problem with emigration, not immigration, Mr. Speaker. Our deepened relationships with the EU have presented an opportunity for us to welcome EU Scots to our region, a great many of whom, as I've said, have settled in the area and contribute to our economy. And already, the UK Government's obsession with unrealistic and counterproductive one-size-fits-all net migration targets overlooks the incredible value of migrant people to our isles and the different economic needs of the Highlands and Islands, and of course those of Scotland as a whole. Over the next 10 years, 90% of Scotland's population growth is projected to come from migration, and this is especially vital for the Highlands. Mr. Speaker, there isn't as much time tonight as I would like to have to be able to explain in depth the importance that EU nationals have to the Highland economy and the importance of our people who go across to work and live and contribute and other EU nations have to us. It is quite simply the fabric of what we do. And this deal and any no-deal scenario that might be proffered by the Prime Minister do nothing, absolutely nothing for the people of Scotland wherever they have come from. And I will be absolutely proud to be with my colleagues in voting down that deal when it comes before this House. And I will say, finally, that once again, the actions of this UK Government in ignoring Scotland, ignoring their people and ignoring their Parliament only make the case for the independence of Scotland much stronger.
Thank you, Mr.